In the last video, we built the efficient frontier, and we had a recommendation for our client to move from this current portfolio up to our recommended portfolio. And we did it by running all the different points on the efficient frontier, comparing it to our current customer, our current portfolio for our client. And so we had this current portfolio, recommended portfolio. So today we want to do, in this video, and what we want to do is put some historical perspective on this, and then we want to do a style analysis. So we'll start with the historical VAR. This is probably the simplest part of the analysis because it's really, you plug in one number and you just look at the numbers and interpret. This is something, what we did in the first video is something you would very normally see from a financial planner. I did those type of efficient frontiers a lot of times in my career, and they do provide a basis for an asset allocation strategy. Very common. I've heard commercials on the local radio. There's a firm called the Mutual Fund Store. They do this type of analysis. They talk about it in their commercials like it's something real advanced and very state-of-the-art, but it's been around for 20, 30, 40 years and is used quite frequently. So you saw how that worked. You can decide for yourself if you think that's a good way to come up with a strategy for how to invest. What we want to do now is what's called historical value at risk. If you're doing this video and doing this project early, the concept of value at risk you may not have seen in the modules yet. So you'll have to just put that to the side. Value at risk is a way of measuring risk. Essentially, historical value at risk just asks the question, at some probability level, how much have I lost historically? I just look and say, what was my worst case scenario historically at some probability? We're going to call that a risk tolerance. And so I think this is great analysis. Very few financial planners actually show this because unfortunately it's a little too embarrassing. But I actually think they should absolutely show this type of analysis. So let's say a financial planner comes in and says, I want you to move from this portfolio to this portfolio, and when you do it, your risk will stay the same, but you'll get a much higher return. The first question you might ask is, well, was that true historically? How did we actually do historically? And so the only thing you have to put in is this risk tolerance. So the risk tolerance is a very subjective number. We'll talk about this some in class. But if you're young, you might have a risk tolerance of, say, 5%. So those that are mid-career, maybe it's 1% to 2%. Or actually, maybe a little bit higher, that maybe 2%. There's no real rules on this, the 3%. And then for those that are in retirement, in or near retirement, they can't take much risk. So they need a very low risk tolerance. So let's say it's 1%. So depending on what client you came up with, you've got to put some number in here. If you're not sure, 1% is a pretty common number. We think in something that happens once, 1 out of 100 years. And so 1% is fine if you have an older client. If you have a newer client, you might do 5%. And what that means is if you use 1%, you're really worried about the downside. You really want to know what that worst case scenario is. Whereas if you're young, you don't have to be quite so conservative. You say, well, I'm not going to worry about stuff that only happens once every 20 years or once every 25 years if you're 4%. That's not a big deal for me. But if you're an older person, something that happens only once every century, you say, well, I'm going to be in retirement maybe 20, 30 years. That once in a century could happen to me. That's pretty likely. And I really can't survive. I can't bounce back from that because I'm not working anymore. I'm not putting money into my retirement plan. So I'm going to use a low risk tolerance of 1%. So that's the rules. Just come up. It's just entirely based on which client you're doing your fictitious financial analysis for. If it's you, then you just have to decide for yourself. But those are the general rules. Young people have high risk tolerances. Older people, people in retirement, have very low risk tolerances. I'm going to use a 1% here. And what we're going to do is we'll bring over our, from the model output, we bring over the current portfolio and we bring over our recommended portfolio. And now we're going to compare the two. Remember what we told our client was that their return would be higher, but their risk could be lower. And here's the returns that we used in our model. We said their return, if you remember the efficient frontier, is going to go from 6.8% up to 7.23%. Well, you look at the actual historical numbers and it's a little embarrassing. The current portfolio actually has a slightly higher return than the recommended portfolio. Why is that? Well, this client was heavily allocated to growth stocks. My model is recommending them to move to value. We know because of the pandemic in the last 5-10 years with the FANG stocks, the Facebook, Amazon, growth stocks have done extremely well. I'm also recommending a high allocation to emerging market stocks, and they haven't done well the last few years. So I'm essentially telling my client, forget history. We think things are going to be very different in the future. You can see now why financial planners don't like to show actual historical numbers, because most people do not want to show these somewhat embarrassing numbers. Their assumptions are very different from the past. Now that can make some sense. We know value stocks have had a long period of underperformance. They usually tend to perform extremely well after that. So this might be the best time to buy value stocks. We know international stocks have done extremely badly the last 30 years. That might mean this is the best time to invest in them. Now my bond allocation was about the same between the two, but we do know that bonds historically have done a lot better than we expect them to do going forward, just because interest rates are so low right now. So it's embarrassing, but that's just the facts. Then when we look at risk, when we look at the VARs, we said it's going to be the same risk level. Now, our VAR risk that we use in our model, we're talking about value risk here. Value risk will be slightly different between the current, because the efficient frontier is just looking at standard deviation. That's what the risk, I really should have labeled these axes. Maybe I'll do that before I save this file back for your final model. But we should have said this is risk defined as standard deviation, and this is return. But value risk is not standard deviation. Value risk, and you'll see that in the definition, is expected return minus 2.33 times the expected standard deviation. So the parametric, the modeled value at risk coming off the efficient frontier will be slightly different, mainly because the two returns are slightly different. And that probably is the difference in these two. It's just a difference in the returns. So the expected value at risk is slightly worse for the current portfolio than the recommended, and that's because we're starting off with a higher return. That'll make more sense when you do the value at risk problems. But the historical VAR, this is the actual risk numbers. You can see that the current portfolio is riskier than our recommended portfolio. So it's very different than what our model shows. Our model says same risk, a higher return. History has shown about the same return, but lower risk for our recommended portfolio. Now, how do you handle this? The way you handle this, you just report the numbers and just admit the fact that our assumptions, and remember you're using my assumptions, so it's obvious the assumptions we're using are different, somewhat different than the actual historical returns of these different asset classes. It usually takes a student 1 or 2 paragraphs to do this part. Most will actually copy and paste this table into their paper and just discuss the awkwardness. It's not always awkward for everyone. This depends on what your recommendation is. Sometimes the historical analysis is right in line with the assumptions for our efficient frontier. Sometimes it's very, very different. It doesn't necessarily show here that I recommend recommended portfolio is worse. The return's about the same, but the risk is lower. It's just that it outperforms because of lower risk and not because of higher returns. So it's a little awkward from that standpoint. But that is historical value at risk. A great analysis. I love doing it. I recommend you actually ask, if you use a financial advisor or a financial planner, that you actually ask these type of questions. So how would what you're recommending have done historically versus what I'm currently doing? If you want me to move from A to B because your assumptions say that is better, I'm not questioning that. I'm not saying you're wrong, but I'm just curious, how would A have done versus B the last 30 years? So here we're going from 1988. So, you know, a little over 30 years, about 33 years. Now you might be asking, how am I getting a 1 in 100? And that's just the way this particular function works. It's doing statistically what a 1 in 100 is based on the data that it has. So there's your historical value of risk. The next thing we're going to do, I really love. I think this is really powerful. We're going to do a style analysis. And so we'll talk about the style analysis. What you have to do with the style analysis is you have to pick a fund. So let's say I don't have a fund in here. I'm going to go find a fund. I gave you some funds over here under mutual fund returns. If you can see that at the bottom there. You're going to pick a fund from there. You cannot pick the one I'm about to use, so I already have that notated. So what is style analysis? So style analysis, you do that, you'll see this little comment box over here. Is if you're looking at a mutual fund that is a balanced mutual fund or an asset allocation fund, a balanced fund or an allocation fund, that's a mutual fund that contains multiple asset classes. Usually it includes both stocks and bonds. It might include gold, it might include US stocks and non-US stocks, but it includes multiple asset classes. And a lot of times these funds are actually called balanced funds or asset allocation funds. So I'll talk in class about this. The most powerful way you can do this analysis is to actually give me a name, email me a name of a fund you're really interested in. Now, if you're watching the video now, it's probably too late. So you might hit pause and say, you know, there's a fund I really want to do, and it's not in Professor Sweet's list of mutual funds. So you might put it on pause, email me, and the next time I'm on campus, I'll get the data for your fund. You have to do this on campus. I have to use the Bloomberg machines to get this. This data is available on Yahoo Finance. The problem is Yahoo Finance does not adjust for capital distributions, capital gains distribution, and that can really distort the performance of these funds and really mess up the analysis. And so I go to Bloomberg that has a process where you can adjust for those capital gain distributions so it doesn't mess up your return. All right, so how are we going to do this? Let me show you the fund I'm going to do, and then you'll have to pick a fund. So let me first show you this mutual fund returns. If you come into this mutual fund returns, the funds in blue are those funds for the style analysis. And I've given you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 funds to choose from. So obviously, if the whole class just picks one of these 8, a lot of you are going to have some overlap. You need to do your own analysis. You can't just copy another class member's analysis, but it is possible some of you will be doing the same funds. But the best thing to do is to use a fund you're actually interested in. So one thing you could do, and I'll talk about this in class so you'll know this before the video, but if you have a 401k plan or a 403b plan that has an asset allocation fund in it, let me see your plan and I might be able to find a mutual fund that mirrors that so you can do the style analysis on your own 401k plan. The one I'm going to use is at the very end over here. You can see in the green, the fund I use for the style analysis, I'm going to use the Vanguard Wellington Fund. It's a very famous fund. It's been around forever. So I'm going to use it so that you cannot use that one. That's the only one that's off. So let me go back to style analysis, and I'm going to go to this B3. I'm going to hit the equal sign. I'm going to go over to the mutual funds return, find the fund that I'm going to do. So the fund I'm going to do is way over here on the end. And I'm just going to hit on the ticker on line 5, hit on the ticker. So you can see in the notes, that's the one fund you're not supposed to do. The VWELX, don't do that fund. All right, and then I got to get the numbers. So again, I'm going to do the equal. I'm going to go over to mutual fund returns. I'm doing the fund that's in column AN. So I'm going to find a date right next to that. So there's my fund. So I'll do that date. And I'll go get the price right there. And then I'm going to copy this down, way down. You can probably just do Control-Shift down and hit Enter. The only time you're going to have an issue with the dates is if you pick a fund that doesn't start in December 87. So if that's the case, you're going to have some problems. You may have to call me to help with that if you do that. But if you start with 1287, I did the funds out through July of 2021. So you won't have that problem. So there is an advantage. If you look at the mutual fund returns, most of them start in 87. Here's one right here that starts in 1994, so you'd have to do some adjustment there, so you might avoid that fund. But I tell you that because if you pick a fund you're interested in and it only starts in like 1990, you have to do a little bit of adjustment. But essentially what you do is you copy the dates down until you get to 7/21, and then you just want to erase everything all the way down, everything below that. You just highlight that and hit delete. But that's not our issue here. So I've got the dates and I've got the fund. I'll copy that down. And that's about all you have to do. And what the style analysis is going to do is it's going to go over here to the right. You don't really see this, but over on the right, it's going to bring in all of these asset classes. And what it's going to do is it's going to change its allocation up here using Solver and change it in a way to get the highest R squared possible. And what that means is it's trying to find an allocation to all of our asset classes that best explains what this VWELX fund is doing. So the best explanation. So right now, what I have loaded in there only explains 70%. That means my mutual fund and its returns and its volatility. Right now, this particular allocation I have in here, which is 70% growth, 5% value, small cap growth, and 20% bonds, that can only explain 70% of what my fund is doing. So let's see if we can get that higher. So what I'm going to do is do data, solver again, and what solver is going to do, it's going to maximize that R squared by, again, changing these allocations subject to the allocations add up to 100%. So if I hit solve and let Bill Gates get to work, he converged. Remember, we don't like the word converge, so I'm going to run it again just in case. We got a pretty good R squared there. So we got a 95% R squared. That's really, really good. Now, hear this, and I'll try to emphasize this in class. You may not get a 95% R squared. I haven't tested all of these funds. I might need to do that before we get to this part in the class, just so I can warn you some funds that are not working as well. I've seen students as low as 70%, and I can live with 70%. It's not great, but it's fine. But so here's what you're going to do in your paper. Here's your recommended portfolio. Remember that back from your model output. You're recommending this portfolio, and you'll have to change the ticker here on this particular graph to put in your ticker for whatever fund you're using. I'm using the VWELX, but whatever you put that there. So we're just comparing these two funds. So what you're going to do is pretend like you're recommending this to your client, but your client says, hey, you know what? I've been using this mutual fund for years. Could I just stick with this mutual fund and rather than change? Is it close enough? And what you're going to do is you can compare, and you're going to see that, hey, it does have a high allocation to large cap. Let me see if I can move that over. Large cap value, but also have a large allocation, large cap growth. It has 1% in gold. I don't have anything in gold. It doesn't have anything in emerging markets. I have 19% in emerging markets. You can see my bond allocation is 19%. This fund is 42% bonds. So you can see, and you'll have to, again, have to manage. Bill Gates does not do a good job on these pie charts. So developed is 2%. We don't have anything in developed. So essentially what we're going to do is say my client came to me with this portfolio, the VWELX. I did a style analysis. I was able to explain 95% of the volatility of my fund by using this allocation. And it is very different than my recommended portfolio. And that's what most, in fact, almost, I think 100% of you will say this. It's very rare you're going to find a mutual fund that's going to match your recommended. Now, I've had a few students get confused and think they have to go out and keep looking until they find a fund that matches their recommended portfolio, but that is not true. All you got to do in your paper is say, my client came to me this fund. I ran a style analysis. I compared that style analysis to my recommended portfolio. I found they were far too different. And so I'm going to tell my client, no, they cannot use VWELX. It's just too different from what I'm recommending. All right, so that's the style analysis. It is a great analysis. I hope some of you will take advantage of this to look at some actual mutual funds. Maybe it's not your mutual fund. Maybe you've got a brother or a parent or a cousin or a nephew, and you go to them and they say, hey, I've been using this T. Rowe Price balanced fund, and it says that it's 40% bonds, 60% stocks. You say, you know what, let me run a style analysis, and let me see if that's really true. And you run the style analysis, and it's only 30% bonds. And you say, wow, man, they may tell you it's 60-40, 60% stocks, 40% bonds, but I ran a style analysis, and historically it's been much more the risk characteristics of 70% stocks and 30% bonds. And they'll be really impressed that you do that. So I have a lot of students, finance students, who work for firms that do style analysis, and they have things like FactSet and Bloomberg that does that for them, but I encourage them to do it manually like we did right here so they can really see the process. The other thing you might put into your paper, I highly recommend, is the style chart. And what this chart shows is how much, while the orange and the blue have the highest correlation of any allocation we could find, as far as the volatility of them when they're up and when they're down, you can see that the Wesley Fund has done a whole lot better. You would have been a lot better buying this Wesley Fund than putting your money into the same allocation with index funds. So it is a very good fund. It's done a great job, but its allocation does not match the allocation you're recommending. So that's style analysis. So I'll stop this video here. We just have one more video to do, which is a manager attribution, another thing I'll really hope you'll get into because it's really powerful.